other countries in Europe where there is much higher representation of women when it comes to public life?
Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for the kind invitation. It's an honor to be here in this distinguished panel and also to have heard some of the brilliant ideas before. I think all these debates, just like the previous session and this one, is about learning from each other. Of course, some countries, from their history, from their larger or shorter democratic history, you know, Romania is a new young democracy, let's say, after restoration of democracy 35 years ago. Before that, we have 5 decades of darkness, of very hard dictatorship, where paradoxically or for some reason the women representation was good, but then what happened is that this is gradual. It's a gradual policy that we are, gender equality, and not just the mandatory quotas, let's say, in the parliament, but even the people, what people think day to day in their daily lives. This, I think, is gradually developing. It has in Romania now. It is a modern society. We have a good quota. It still can be higher in the parliament, I have to admit. We have a much better situation, and I'm happy that it is so in diplomacy, in Romanian diplomacy. We have actually just exactly 50% of women in Romanian foreign ministry and about 40% ambassadors.
40% of all Romanian ambassadors are women?
Are women today, yes.
And 50% of all foreign service officers in Romania happen to be women. That's fantastic.
This, I think, is also thanks to this field being the one, as you said, we're talking about the world most exposed to the world, where, women and policymakers, men alike, have understood the value of this equality, and in general, not discriminating or positive discriminating women necessarily, but the value of this equality.
Ma'am, 50% foreign service officers, women, 40% of them ambassadors. The Indian Foreign Service, is the numbers sort of comparable?
Well, I think today it is much better than what it was at the time of independence. I still remember my very distinguished senior colleague, Ambassador C.B. Mothamma. She was the first Indian lady to join the civil service. She did the first exam that was there, and she joined the Foreign Service. And she had a very difficult time because she was not getting a promotion as secretary. She had to go to court to take the Ministry of External Affairs to court to get her promotion as secretary. And then she was not getting promoted as ambassador, because then again she went to court. So it was a very difficult time. When I joined the Foreign Service in '71, there was still a rule that married women could not join the Foreign Service.
There was a rule that married women could not join the Foreign Service?
Yes.
Wow.
And when I joined and wanted to get married, I was told that I have to apply for permission to get married, and it could be refused. And in fact, the letter that I got said, you're being given permission, but in future you may be called upon to resign. So it was a very difficult start, but we have, through a process of evolution, which I believe in, very friendly conversations and no revolution, no going on the street, but we've been able to change a lot. There was economic discrimination as well. They never even gave similar allowances to women and men when we were posted abroad.
So when you joined, how many women ambassadors were there, or how many women foreign services were there in your officers were there in your batch?
When I joined at that time, the number of women joining in each batch was roughly 10 to 15%.
Okay.
And the number of ambassadors abroad was still much less than that, far, far less. Would hardly have been in the range of maybe less than 5%. But today, I think over time, because a lot of conditions of service have improved, and so I think that the number of women joining the Foreign Service is much higher, around 40% every year. Every batch, about 40% join the Foreign Service, and overall number of ambassadors about 20%, I think.
20% ambassadors and 40% in the Foreign Service.
Yes.
But let me come back to Ambassador Latif. Generally when you talk about European countries, whether it's the Scandinavian countries, whether it's Western European countries, they have almost 50% representation of women, whether it is in Parliament, National Assembly. In the case of Romania, I believe, to the EU Parliament, Romania is the second or the third lowest in terms of women members of European Parliament being sent. I think it's less than 15%, whereas most other countries, it's more than 50%. Why is that?
Well, I think, first of all, because we don't have mandatory quotas for women representation on our electoral lists, locally or nationally, or for the European elections. As you know, members of the European Parliament are elected locally in Romania. So there is not that, it's not mandatory. On the other hand, we've offered also our proposals for the European Commissioner. You know, each member state can offer a proposal for a certain portfolio. The past two have been women. So when it comes to high decision making, it had been women. Now the Vice President of the European Commission is from Romania is a woman. So maybe there is a balance in that. I have to be optimistic, I think, but indeed there is still a work to do. As I said, even in our national parliament, still there is...
So is there a particular reason why certain countries have intra-party quotas for women as opposed to a country like Romania, which does not?
I believe, I cannot speak for other countries. I think it's just a decision they took, like this is being debated now in India a certain time. I've been in part of these discussions with other countries where I've served, the exchanges between our parliaments, whether this is, how this is being brought upon. Of course, there are arguments favorable to that. There will be always hesitation also. But hopefully we are, as I said, in the parliament, in the politics field now, we have many ministers also in the government. Again, not parity, but they are becoming more and more visible. And I think it's, like Ambassador was saying, a matter of the society itself being, now it's more modern, but we have also been a rather, traditional society. Even in the ministry, I know 20 years ago when I joined, there were much less, of course. And we had noticed always there were very many women in leading positions of departments in the ministry, which is, let's say, equivalent director general, equivalent ambassadors, but they would not be sent ambassadors because for a woman still at that time, it was more like difficult to be able, her husband to follow her, her kids to follow her. So they were good for a lot of work in the ministry, whereas the men were taking the ambassadorship positions more easily, because it was perceived, and it was a reality then, that the woman more easily leaves her job and follows a man abroad, where the other case was not. Now, thankfully, with the evolution of the society, fathers are also staying home with the kids. Fathers can also work from other countries, or the families have found their format of, being able to, for the woman to also take more position as ambassador.
Ambassador, there's one sort of debate around entry-level barriers for women in the foreign service. There's also the question of how many actually climb up to the top, and you have, faced this up close and personal. But tell me, I mean, we've had two, I think, women foreign ministers, Indira Gandhi and Sushma Swaraj.
Yes.
We've had, I think, 3 Indian women foreign secretaries, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Why is it that there aren't more in the last 75 years of our independence? Why are there no more women foreign ministers, women foreign secretaries, and even secretaries in the ministry?
Well, I think that, one of the things that is very important is participation. And I think that's the greatest strength of this Women's Reservation Bill that has been introduced in Parliament and now going to be voted on very soon, is that it ensures participation. And I think that in the Foreign Service as well, in all other civil services, the participation in the civil service exam, that is very important. You've got to encourage women to get the education, because I think that there are many, many bright women, as many as among the men, in fact, probably more so. But many of them would not be taking the exam because their parents say, no, you get married, you don't go, we don't know what kind of a career, you'll have difficulty, you'll be alone, and so on. So I think the participation is the first step, encouraging women to take that exam and join the civil service. And as you join, then you get the 3 other requirements, which is voice, agency, and leadership. Now, the leadership is the final stage that, when you join, then you get the voice, you can speak for yourself, you can show your performance, and then you get the support for it, you get the agency to see what you should do, and you get the leadership. I think we are at the stage where leadership needs to be developed a lot more, but participation has improved a lot. Ever since I left the Foreign Service, I have my own group called the South Asia Women's Network, and we bring together women from 9 different countries of South Asia. And in this group, we are working a lot with rural women, because 65% of India still lives in the rural areas. And unless you can get this participation and agency and leadership for the rural women, it's not going to help women at all overall. And I think this bill actually is going to give that participation to rural women much more than even to urban women, because urban women are much more agile and much more able to look after themselves.
Ambassador, you were mentioning when we were speaking off stage that in Delhi, in the diplomatic community in Delhi, there is an active number of women ambassadors. You said there were 40 women ambassadors in Delhi currently?
I think about 40, maybe 30 something, almost 40. It's fluctuating every departure or arrival of a new ambassador. But it's a pretty active and present, visible group.
What does that say about Delhi as a city and the fact that women ambassadors want to come here, serve here? I don't think that would have been the case 20 years ago, when ma'am was serving. But 40 out of, let's say, 100 plus countries is a fairly good number.
Yeah. I actually remember visiting India 18 years ago and speaking to a lady ambassador from a South American country, and I remember they were much less, and sometimes their life was not so easy. Yeah. Like, I have to say, we are really privileged and blessed now to be here. First of all, Delhi, I think it's an impressive capital because you have almost all countries here present, just like in New York or Washington or wherever, only to the UN, I think you have more, all the member states. And here you have so many ambassadors, agencies, also UN agencies and multilateral organizations. So it's very, very diverse. Inevitably, there will be women. I think, again, I speak for Romania, we're not afraid to send women anywhere they want. We have a woman ambassador in Tehran, for example, now. For a while already, before the current situation, we have women ambassadors anywhere. But that said, of course, I was very honored I never hesitated for a second in terms of I haven't even asked myself this question. And I think this is when actually we realize we're in a good phase, when it's a normality, when we don't talk about whether I am a woman or not, when we are all doing our job, and it's not an issue.
It's become normalized, you're saying, which again brings us back to the question of, when it comes to the reservation, has the conversation become normalized to the point where this has to be the de facto, that there are 33% women in our parliament, in our elected bodies, etc., or are we still some ways off from where this conversation becomes normalized?
I think this is a very significant, a very necessary first step to get that normalization. But I think the 2 or 3 aspects you should look at. One is, I think, from normal life, we already have seen discussions about changing mindsets. And I think changing mindsets is critical because it impacts women in cases like, say, gender-based violence against women. The mindset is such that, the men think we do it because we can. There actually are surveys which show that. It's just that they think that they're right. So that has to change. That's very important. And in the diplomatic world, for example, I think one of the biggest lacunae is reflected through a UN Security Council resolution passed in 2000, 26 years ago, 1325, which was on women's participation in peacemaking and conflict resolution. And we find that while women and children are the greatest victims of all disasters, natural, man-made wars, look at what's happening now in the Gulf, in Gaza, it's huge. But when it comes to conflict resolution, comes to peacemaking, where women have the greatest stake, they're not there at all. Look at the talks in Islamabad on the Gulf War. Not a single woman, not even one. And similarly in most of the other negotiations, you see that no women at all. So actually, again, the same point about participation, you've got to get women as diplomats, as women who have achieved in their fields, to come into fields like conflict resolution. In today's world, we are so riven by these conflicts all over the world, and they seem to be having no solution. They seem to be getting worse instead of getting better, multiplying instead of reducing to zero. And there's no role for women in conflict resolution. We have to find that. I think in India we've achieved a lot by getting the reservation for women in the panchayats.
Correct.
So in grassroots development, there is a role for women, although we know that the implementation has been varied across states, but at least it's a very, very good step. And now with 33% reservation at the top in leadership in parliament, which is the apex of democracy, apex of lawmaking, I think it will help in a big role, but we have to always keep our eye open for the lacunae. I mean, look at the question of coming to mindset and women's unpaid work. In rural areas, women do all the work, but they're not even included in the workforce. And the work they do is not even included in the GDP.
Yeah.
And what they do in terms of childcare, care for the elderly, In many countries in Europe, that's probably one of the largest items in every social welfare budget. But in India, the social welfare budget has very little for that. And what the women do is not even counted. So there are other areas, but I'm sure that once you have 33% parliamentarians as women, they will go into these areas very deeply.
I just want to take forward the point that ma'am was making about the role of women in conflict resolution. She brought about the example of the recent talks that happened in Islamabad. There weren't any women at that high table. Do you reckon all these wars that we are going through currently, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Ukraine, will probably have not been there or been better resolved had more women been at the high diplomatic table?
Well, again, this is exactly the role we're talking about women would get, but I think there is, without generalizing or putting labels on men, women, or nations and peoples, the best result can be. So certainly, I believe women had been there. We could advance with different mindsets. We to compromise, to find a compromise in our families, from daily chores, tasks, and then to work as well. I'm sure there could be a different result. Maybe it's time for a UN Secretary General, women
to be a woman
also.
But again, I come back to that point about the conflicts, because I think from a world where institutions were setting the rules and there was always respect for institutions, we've now come to a world where it's might is right. The more powerful country sets the terms, and the weaker countries have to fall in line. And again, all of those decision makers happen to be men. So do you think that could change in the future, or is this the new paradigm, the new rule, let's say the new rule of the rules-based world order?
First of all, we have the UN Charter that we have to still, in Romania's position has always been one very strong in favor of respecting the international norms and rules that we have. Whether this is indeed every war, every crisis we are noticing, it's becoming more volatile, it's true. We see why and what happens when this is not respected. So while respecting that, indeed, if more women can be involved in all structure, it would be helpful. But I don't think, we're talking about so many reforms that should be there, about country membership and women representation is probably one of the aspects, but I think it's still a rather long way. I think if we just at least started to focus and respect what we have, which could work, I think we would have a pretty good system if respected. It still would go a long way.
Do you think that, ma'am, that we were basically living in a world where the more powerful countries are setting the rules of engagement, and incidentally, all of them happen to be ruled by men?
The NATO allies of the USA, the NATO countries and the European allies of the USA, they have already started the pushback, and they have not joined the hostilities in the Gulf, and they are arranging, I think UK and France are already arranging a conference to see if you can use parliamentary tactics, discussion and dialogue, definitely, to resolve this, to keep the Strait of Hormuz open and keep the world economy on a more even keel than subject to these, perpetual depressions and increase in prices of energy and increase in prices of fertilizer, which are setting many countries on the path of economic ruination. So I think that there is a pushback. And I think that there are many voices, even in India, if you see the debate and the dialogue about it, the attempt is to have there is going to be a new rules order in the world. The old order has changed. I think that old order probably will not come back. But what we will have in its place will, I hope, be also very democratic, and everybody has to fight for it, knowing that it's part of your own national self-interest. Because of that.
Ambassador, again, I'm coming back to that point that Ambassador Veena Sikri made, that, there was certain accepted norms and rules, even alliances. What we have seen first in the Ukraine war and now in the Iran war is those established norms, alliances, NATO, for example. There is a deep division now within NATO, both in the execution of the Gulf War as well as in the execution of the Ukraine war. Do you see this schism sort of being permanent across Atlantic, or do you think this is again a cycle? Maybe a new political dispensation, a new president comes, it might change. How do you view this division that's suddenly cropped up?
I think if you ask I think maybe last year there was a census in Romania, some polls, and we are among the top, if not the most pro-European country and pro-NATO, so we are also one of the last ones to join. We are still seeing much more benefits, or mostly benefits, from these two organizations like others that have been anchors for our stability and for our region. And this is why we are promoting also Republic of Moldova, Ukraine to join the EU, because we have seen what development. Romania's GDP is 10 times now more than before it joined the European Union. And that's not just prosperity, it's stability, it's the partnership we have with the US is as important in our security. We know very well the role the US had in our post-communist history. So I think in Romania, we will always be the optimists of Europe or NATO. We see the benefits. Being next to, we have the longest border with the war with Ukraine. We have seen the value of the cooperation with benefit from the EU member states, because we had more than 6 million refugees from Ukraine crossing our territory. Not all have stayed, about 200,000 have stayed, but mostly women and children, as you were speaking, mostly the men have stayed in the war, and they have tried to escape with their children. And we have had more than half of the cereals, the grains, which you know how important they were, from Ukraine, blocked in Ukraine, important for the North Africa, Middle East regions, and they had to go through Romanian rivers, ports, railroads, custom points, that we were not able to do on our own. So that's where we saw the cooperation, the benefits of cooperating support from other member states that have supported financially with expertise to have such huge influx of transports, people, goods. So of course there will always be nuances. There will always be. This is the joy of democracy. The EU, as opposed to NATO, has we have ceded a lot of our political policies. Have the commercial policies, and others are completely European. Others are still national prerogatives. But still, whenever we have to decide, it's difficult to take a decision at 27, of course. But we have made them, and I think if something, like they say, we were talking recently in a similar format, never waste a good crisis. If something has happened, unfortunately, after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, we have seen a stronger voice of Europe to get easy to come, as I said, at 27, but once it's there, it's very strong, it's very stable, it's being implemented. We have such...
A second, but on the Iran war, two things are sort of holding up this peace, or some form of a lasting peace. One is obviously the nuclear question, this whole unresolved question of what happens to the enriched stockpile. And second, and I think more importantly for India and for countries in this part of the world, about the Strait of Hormuz. On a matter of principle, whether countries can start tolling or charging ships that pass through a vital waterway, India has deep stakes and deep concerns if that were to become a precedent. And yet at the same time, the statements that we're seeing from the White House, from President Trump, seems to indicate that America doesn't need Hormuz, it's the other countries that need Hormuz. So let China come, let India come, let the other countries come and open up this waterway. How does India sort of view this?
I think India has been always strongly in favor of dialogue and diplomacy, and I think our leadership, our Prime Minister, is one of the few who has been able to speak to all sides. Whether it is President Trump or President of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, or the leaders of the other Gulf countries, UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain, Kuwait, and all of them, and also the leaders of Europe. And I think, very importantly, we do believe in international free waterway in the Strait of Hormuz. Because unlike Suez Canal and Panama Canal, where there have been developments, and because of the infrastructure developments, you've had the payment for passing through it. But in the Strait of Hormuz, it's always been an internationally free waterway, like the Strait of Malacca, and of course that's how we want the South China Sea to be as well. So to keep these waterways the way they are, it is very important to join with like-minded countries on ensuring that it's a free waterway. And I think that Iran is ready, but they're using it as a conditionality.
Yeah.
So that's the point. It's become a huge bargaining chessboard. And that chessboard is so complex today that, I think everybody's trying to move a few pawns here and there, but you're not getting a solution. And nobody wants to be checkmated. And so I think it is very worrisome, because I think that although there's talk of extending the ceasefire, it seems quite likely that if you have an indefinite blockade of Iran going on, then there could be a resort to violence again, which is very worrisome, and then you could have the whole violence starting again. I think domestic opinion in USA is very against it, so that is perhaps one of the restraining factors. And I certainly, the important point about what's happening in Iran today is that they have been so-called close to peace 4 times in the past. They did the JCPOA in 2015, which said in its first line that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. But then that was abrogated. Then you had talks, I think last year, which were then broken off, and you had the attacks on the nuclear weapon. Then you had talks in February this year, which was supposed to be very close. The foreign minister of Iran, of Oman, was mediating those talks, and he said that they were very close to a breakthrough. But then the violence, the attack started on the 28th of February, and now this is the 4th time or the 5th time. So I think the apprehension of parties all around that whether it's going to again be a similar mirage and going to lead to violence is a big question. I think that, you know, countries who are getting together, like India had participated in the first conference that UK had called on free waterway in the Strait of Hormuz. So the second one now is perhaps going to be called soon. And I do think that such initiatives should get bigger and bigger. So you get a big body of world opinion saying, now this is it. We just don't want.
We need to open up.
Because everybody's economic growth and perspectives and planning, everything is being affected.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, can we have a round of applause for Ambassador Latif and Ambassador Sikri? Thank you very much for joining us on the Nari Shakti conclave here at Times Now.